Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. So, I had heard of PLATO before. I knew it existed, but I'll admit I didn't know much about it until very recently. PLATO was an online and interactive learning computer system developed in the 1960s at the University of Illinois. But in the early 1970s, PLATO got truly networked, and the users took over, users in this case being teenagers. PLATO had already pioneered such things as touchscreen computing, but the kids taking over meant that concepts like forums, message boards, email, chat rooms, instant messaging, multiplayer games, and even emoticons or emojis were pioneered on the PLATO system. Today we're going to talk to Brian Deer, the author of The Friendly Orange Glow, the untold story of the PLATO system and the dawn of cyberculture. You'll hear the story of PLATO's development from someone who actually used it, and I highly recommend buying the book because this is really technology history done right. 30 years of research on this topic. A topic that's been criminally overlooked in technology histories up to this point. And so hopefully, after Friendly Orange Glow, PLATO will take its rightful place as one of the key precursors of our modern online world. And believe me, no more definitive book will ever be written on this topic. So please enjoy this excellent conversation with Brian Deer. Brian Deer, thanks for coming on the Internet History Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm gonna plug right at the beginning, although we'll remember to do it at the end. We're going to be talking about a great book that you all can get right away called The Friendly Orange Glow, and it's about a technology called PLATO, which we're going to discuss in detail right now. I wonder if we could start by telling me the story of your personal first encounter with PLATO.
Sure. So I was a brand new freshman undergrad, roaming the campus, getting lost at the University of Delaware, September of 1979. And I wandered into the music building because I always liked music, and I thought, well, let's see what's going on in there. And the way it works with music buildings on a university campus, every room has some different musical instrument sound coming from it. It's like somebody's practicing a saxophone, and then a violin, then a piano. So it's all noise throughout the building. And I'm walking through, and I see this one room that has no lights on. And like a lot of rooms, like even this room, there's a glass floor-to-ceiling window that lets you peek into what's going on in that room, and it's a classroom. And the lights are off, but there's all these orange screens and all these terminals, and everybody's got headphones on, and a lot of them are reaching out with their finger and touching parts of the screen, and they're listening to stuff. And then I'm looking through the glass, and I see that that's musical notation on the screen, and like the same crisp level, high resolution graphics of musical notes and staffs and all measures and all that, just like in sheet music. And at the bottom of half of the screen is a keyboard. And that was impressive. And it's all bright orange. Okay, it's just monochrome, black and orange. And I had never seen anything like it. The whole room had the vibe of like a air traffic control center, right? I mean, it was so I wander in, and I see a poster on the wall that says "Welcome to PLATO," and then it had little instructions. You could sit down at an available terminal and log on using demo as an account and get a demo. And of course I did that, and I was very impressed. The graphics were astounding, I mean, considering every other computer I'd seen was, punch cards and, all kinds of.
Well, primarily text.
Yeah, it was also if you even had a terminal.
Right.
Sometimes it was just sort of like a printer/keyboard combination, real primitive stuff. And that was my first exposure to Plato. I kept coming back every time I tried it. Someone would say, "Hey, forget the demo. Try this," and they give me some other menu, and then I would discover that there's games on the system, and there were what were called notes files, which is essentially message boards on every topic imaginable. And that, once in a while you'd notice that people weren't using these things just for education. They were laughing, they were playing games, they were chatting with people. And then I realized Plato is a interpersonal computer system. It's not just, a number cruncher, or in this case, a sort of a educational delivery system where you're a student, you sit down and you take a lesson, and your professor assigned you 1 hour a week to take some lesson in anthropology or biology or whatever So I was hooked, and I had entered Delaware as a English/journalism major, but after a few weeks, I think it's safe to say I was a Plato major. And unfortunately, that was not an official degree.
But you ended up working for, this is getting ahead of things, but you worked for Plato for a little while.
Well, I found out real fast that you could get a job at the Plato project at the University of Delaware. You just had to learn how to program using their language called Tutor, and then you could do stuff, for the project, and it was like, done. I mean, you can get paid to have fun, So, within like 2 months, I had taken all the seminars, learning how to program the stuff, and they hired me, and so it was great. And then I found out that University of Delaware is like this distant, remote outpost on the net that is Plato. It was all over the world. I didn't realize that. I thought this was just a Delaware thing, and it turned out, Delaware is not even the big deal. Illinois is the big deal.
Yeah.
So I did what everyone did in those years, which is you make a pilgrimage to Mecca, Mecca being Urbana, Illinois, to the building from whence the orange glow originates, and which turns out to be a really frumpy, really old, ugly, beat up brick building, not the kind of gleaming ivory tower which I thought it would be, like some super high tech,
a technology hub, right?
Yeah. I assumed something this futuristic would be like the building would be just some miraculous thing that Google or Apple would just react to, but no, it was pure function. It was a 100-year-old building. It used to be the power plant. The entrance to the doorway says powerhouse above it, which I always thought was appropriate, given that I would argue Plato totally was a powerhouse. So,
well, before we get into the background of Plato, you mentioned that people would say, now try this, now try this. So you personally, what was it that you were doing? Was it the games? Was it the chatting with people? What was the primary thing that in those years you did on Plato?
Oh, well, no, there was Delaware was notorious for establishing certain kind of rules because people discovered real fast that Plato was an incredibly cool thing to do and a cool place to be online and that kind of thing. And it was the only place to be online in those years. So they, when I was getting paid, when I was a student programmer for the project, I wrote all kinds of programs. I actually wrote a spreadsheet in like 1979 or 80 that figured out the pay raises for the whole staff, which was kind of funny because I got to see the pay raises for everybody, just me and the person at the, and then I would work. They would ask me like, go clean up this program, or you need to program this or that, lessons in various subject areas or whatever. A lot of it was utility work just for the organization itself, and their staff and managing that and all that. But then, of course, after hours or whatever, there were games galore, and you could never tire of discovering games. I mean, they were incredible games, and a lot of them were restricted because they were so wildly popular till late hours. And then you discovered that there's a whole other scene where people are hanging out, doing all-nighters on Plato, playing games, chatting. And if you were really lucky, you might find somebody who knows how to get on what was called the link, which would essentially connect you 1,000 miles to Minnesota, bounce off the Plato system there to Illinois, and then you could link in and sign on the Illinois system all remotely, and check out all the games and the notes files there, because that was like the New York City of being online when it came to Plato in the late 70s, early 80s. And it was basically non-stop discovery. Every single time you sat down to Plato, there was so much new stuff that it was completely overwhelming. Kind of like, the net is that way today, and it's so overwhelming, we can't even comprehend it anymore, right? I mean, anyone's news feed, if you're on Twitter or Facebook or anything, the feed is too much. And it was too much even on Plato. And that was addicting,
Okay, so let's ground this then. You've mentioned that Plato was designed as an education tool, and in the book you start off with like B.F. Skinner,
right,
and things like that. So tell me about the genesis of Plato and the idea. Basically, it's the idea of using computers as education tools for the very first time.
Right, and I think education tool would be too gentle. I think it was a much more bold, crazy ambitious goal. Basically, the vision was, starting in 1960, was to design a computer system that would teach and behave and act and do everything that a human teacher could do to teach a student some subject. And the system was designed in such a way that it didn't really matter. They were very agnostic as to what the subject matter might be or how you might teach it. And so there are all kinds of, design styles and approaches that many teachers have. There are all kinds of different things. There's, many different philosophies on the best way of teaching, and it turns out that, surprise, surprise, most people differ in their way they learn the fastest and the most efficiently from everyone else. So there isn't any single way. So flexibility was crucial. And this was the vision, and it was a gigantic leap. I mean, I'm still kind of in awe that they made this leap, that a computer could essentially do the job of teaching a student some subject, whether it was, the humanities or the hard sciences or anything like that. So that was the idea initially, and the Plato project at the University of Illinois had a very crystal clear mission kind of sense to it. The people there were very mission focused. I often equate them with the sense of mission that the Apollo mission had. It was totally an era of optimism, wild optimism, and I figure, it's like, hey, if the U.S. can go to the moon in 10 years, all during the 60s they worked on it. Why not, do something much more mundane, quote unquote, and that would be to build a computer system that can teach. And there were lots of projects going on around the country doing this, but Plato was probably the most unusual because of its hardware. Because the guy who founded Plato was an electrical engineer and really kind of like a Nikola Tesla type, a real wizard when it came to electricity. One person told me once that he was known to stick his finger into an electrical socket just to sense whether the power was really 60 hertz or not. He could tell.
But you haven't named him. Who are we talking
Donald Bitzer.
Yes, okay.
Don Bitzer, his nickname was Bits, which is almost corny in the sense that, because of computer bits and all that stuff. But B-I-T-Z. But, Don Bitzer was an absolute character who belongs in the pantheon of, computer luminaries, right up there with Wozniak, Jobs, Bill Gates, the rest of them. An absolutely, a brilliant guy. And he had this dream of building a flat panel monitor that when you looked at the screen, when you looked at the pixels, you were actually looking at the memory. So if a dot was lit on the screen, that meant that unit of memory, that bit of memory was on. And so the huge breakthrough, I mean, it was a major patent in the 60s, was the flat panel display. And here we are sitting in a room right now with a big flat panel display on the wall. This, I don't know if this is plasma or LCD, but the whole notion of plasma televisions comes straight from those patents for Plato. Mm-hmm. And it's basically one long progression of development from the fundamental Plato plasma patents. So that was one of the things that made Plato really unusual. It took basically 10 years to get to the point where they were in production and being manufactured and getting in the hands of students. So in 1972, the Plato terminals now had 512 by 512 graphics, bitmap graphics displays that were orange pixels on a black background. And there was nothing else in the world that looked anything like it. And they added touch sensitivity to those screens, so you could reach out and touch and interact that way. And whereas, like at the time, Xerox PARC had decided to go the mouse route. And the Xerox PARC people and the Plato people had all kinds of debates. They visited each other's labs. There was a lot of interaction between the two labs, which no one really knows about, and I devote a whole chapter in the book to that. And one of the things they debated about is whether there should be mice or touch screens, and Plato decided touch. And it's interestingly, they did that 40 years before Steve Jobs marches out onto the stage and introduces the iPhone and announces, we're not going to do any kind of device. It's going to be your finger for touch.
We have 5 stylus.
Right, exactly. And they were making the same argument in the Plato world 40 years earlier, which is kind of interesting. So
you mentioned, I'm going to bring it back to the beginning again. It comes out of that same burst of funding that after Sputnik happens and the government, the U.S. decides that it's behind technologically with the Russians. So Plato is funded by some of the same people that will eventually fund what we know as the ARPANET and the internet. It's the ARPA, NSF, and people like that.
Right, and which is remarkable. I mean, there was a very small cast of characters in Washington writing the checks for basically all the major computer innovations that were going on in the 60s, and basically the same people. Mm-hmm. J.C.R. Licklider, and who's kind of famous in this field, was involved with ARPA, and Bob Taylor, who would wind up going over to Xerox PARC, was very much involved with ARPA. These people all knew the people at Plato. They were very familiar with that project, and of course they were all driving ARPANET as well. So the two projects were just two of many and working in parallel. Not a lot of cross-fertilization, certainly. They were very different projects with different goals and reasons and all that stuff. But it's just interesting that the people writing the checks were roughly the same people.
So you said that the project takes about 10 years before it actually gets in front of real students on.
Well, no, with the orange displays. Okay. But prior to that, they were using CRTs in a much more primitive way.
Well, so this is what I want to get to is in the 60s, we're talking about the era of mainframes. We're talking about that even timeshare is still a new concept. So the initial versions, I think there's 4.
Right.
Plato, right? So Plato's 1, 2, 3. In a classroom setting with students, right. How is the system set up?
Well, Plato 1 was basically the prototype. Mm-hmm. That was what a startup today would call the demo. Mm-hmm. That was the proof of concept, and that basically wasn't even time sharing. That was 1960, and it basically proved that one student could sit down at what at the time was a $10 used broken TV set that they just found somewhere, and the tuner didn't work, but the screen worked, and that's all they needed. And a little box, it wasn't even a keyboard. I mean, that would be too grandiose to describe it that way. It had 16 buttons on it, so it didn't even have the full alphabet or anything. And really, really crude. I mean, total proof of concept. And it was all hooked up to the iliac, which is one of the mythical iron beasts of the earliest age of computing. It was built in 1952, and it was full of thousands of vacuum tubes, which would last, a matter of hours, a few thousand hours, or maybe it wasn't even that. I mean, they were burning out all the time, and there were thousands of them to replace. So it's just a, nightmare kind of machine that they were working from. There was no programming language. It was all pure machine code. It was worse than assembly. I mean, it was like really zeros and ones and stuff. So that was the environment they started with. PLATO 2 also ran on the Iliac, and they got time sharing working on that. And the PLATO people argue they invented, or at least built and demoed time sharing before MIT. If you look up time sharing in Wikipedia or anywhere else, all the history books or whatever say MIT did time sharing. And they did. It's just that Illinois did it a few weeks or months earlier. The problem is Illinois was not prepared to do patents yet, and or it took them like a year to get around to doing a patent. So by the time they were got around to it, MIT had already grabbed that one. So PLATO 3 then came out in around 1963, and they had moved by then to a control data 1604, which was a faster, cheaper, better machine. It was kind of like an early supercomputer, even though if you look at it now, it looks like a desk with a couple of boxes and a couple of tape machines, and not very impressive at all. But at the time, it was the latest, coolest thing with lots of knobs and blinking lights and, everything you'd see in a movie, And they used that thing all the way up to 1971. And that was PLATO 3. And PLATO 4, and we're talking Roman numerals here, so PLATO Roman numeral 4 finally came out around 72. And that's when everything completely changed. It was now running on a control data cyber supercomputer. And I have often characterized PLATO 4 as really being pronounceable as PLATO IV in the sense of intravenous, because it was so addictive. And that was the one that was designed to support 4,000 simultaneous terminals, pretty huge scale of time sharing. They never quite got to that. And I talk about all of that in part 3 of the book, which is getting to scale. That's the whole theme of that. Because, even back then, the whole dream, just like any startup today, it's all about scale, right? You come up with an idea, you get everything kind of working out, and then you scale, and you hope to get to millions of users. That's exactly what they were thinking even in the 70s. So,
well, also, reading the book, I felt like that the Tudor programming language, which you already mentioned, was also the big breakthrough. Again, using startups as a metaphor here, because when Tudor comes along, allowing anyone to program modules for it, then you have that let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Right.
That sort of lets the system take.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I would say, in a way, the arrival of Tudor was kind of like the arrival of HTML. Because, one of the great thrills of the early web was that you could view source on any website. Or, you just go and it's like, oh, that's how they did it. Oh, now look how they did that.
Yeah.
And, it was like, oh, that's a little trick. That's very interesting. And then you just started to notice everybody was copying everybody. And the same thing was happening in the PLATO world. And so there was a really thrilling, exciting era, just like we would then see with the web years later, where people were copying code, sort of challenging each other with new and more clever ways to do something with less, typing with less characters so that it would load faster and all that kind of stuff. And it was a very similar kind of effect.
Tudor comes out in 67?
67,
and it
right.
was implemented by a grad student. Was he working on the project?
Yeah. His name was Paul Tensar, and he was just really frustrated. And this is another thing. Technology usually comes around, it's kind of like the old saying about innovation is and necessity, or necessity is the mother of invention, right? And I think I don't know if it's necessity or just pure frustration is the mother of innovation, But Tensar was just really frustrated with the snail's pace of productivity that he saw to build some of the biology kind of lessons that he was building on the Plato 3 machine, and it was because the development environment was just really, really crude. There were a lot of things happening very quickly in 67, 68 that would make it more productive, but they didn't have a friendly programming language that was kind of like what Apple did in the 80s when they came out with HyperCard, which, amazingly doesn't exist now, which is insane. iOS should have HyperCard built in. Anybody should be able to quickly build up an app and share it. But I guess for security reasons they can't do it, but it's a real shame. So when Tutor arrived, and it arrived practically overnight, because Tensar basically sat down and pulled an all-nighter to put together enough commands so that you could put stuff on the screen, you could draw circles and triangles and all that. And it was the equivalent of the classic hello world that you see in any programming language. That's the first program you ever write. Right. It's kind of like, do we have a pulse? Yes, we have a pulse. And we can even put it on a certain point on the screen, or we can put it at the bottom, top, whatever. So that's kind of, and Tutor was such a gigantic leap ahead. Everything else that the Plato people were using to develop stuff at the time almost, very, very quickly fell out of favor. And Tutor kind of ruled from then on, and it became a very rich language, which for all time, even up to today, any computer scientist will poo-poo and look at and go like, that's not a real language. That is a horrible kludge of a language and all this stuff. But it wasn't designed for computer scientists. It was designed for plain people who had a lot of work to do, needed to crank out a lot of material, be as interactive and fun for the user as possible, do lots and lots of graphics, and get it up on the screen and keep cranking the stuff out, because they had a huge amount of work to do. And so for those kind of users, which is basically mere mortals, it was an incredible leap forward. And it turned out that language also turned out to be great for developing games, something that I don't think they were quite thinking of, and we can talk about that some if you want.
Well, yeah, no, let's talk about that, because to me another great moment in the book was, it's almost like the system breaks out of the lab when all of a sudden the users start to tinker with it. And so I feel like the point that you make in the book is that it's when they first, they take it to high schools around Illinois, right, at first. And
well, no, it's not quite like that. And I wouldn't say the system broke out of the lab. It was the kids broke into the lab.
Gotcha. Oh, yes, you're right. So tell us.
So basically, there were high schools all over Champaign-Urbana, and there was one legendary high school that was actually one of these laboratory schools that the university itself ran, and it was right across the street from CERL, CERL, which is the Computer-Based Education Research Lab, which is the home of Plato. That's what's in that frumpy building. And so this little high school was called Uni High, or University Laboratory High School, but everybody just called it Uni or Uni High. And those kids had it great because they were so close, and they would literally just wander over, and the doors were open to the CERL lab, and they'd go in, and they wouldn't get kicked out. That was the incredible thing. Almost every other computer lab in that era was a locked up place where you needed to have a PhD and wear a lab coat and probably a stethoscope or who knows what. You had reasons to be there. And at CERL, they were just very open and inviting, even with kids wandering in. And part of it was practical because they never had enough budget. They never had enough people working on the system. And if it turned out a kid was really bright and only 13 years old but could do the job, hire him.
Right.
And it turned out they did.
There's lots of stories of that in the book.
Right. So that's how kids were drawn to it. And of course, word got out all over town that the coolest computer in the world with a crazy orange display is right there on the campus. And they won't chase you away. You can actually do stuff, including make games. And of course, that was the end of that. Much to the embarrassment, I think, of the people running the Plato project, because this was never an official thing in the the proposals that they sent to the National Science Foundation or to ARPA or anything like that, saying, oh yeah, by the way, we're now going to build games and turn Plato into the first, big social media platform. And no, that never happened. It was the kids who brought all that sensibility into the system. And I devote really basically a third of the book, which is part 2 of the book, to that whole story and to the characters that arrived and did stuff. And that's really the core of the whole story.
You make a point similar to one that I've made on the show before, which is that one of the things that it seems like no one in early computing, it never occurred to anyone that computers would be a great communication tool.
Yes, exactly.
And time and again, on this show, in your book, and other histories and things like that, it's always the communication that is what gets the mainstream users hooked.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's pure human nature. People like to yak, and they like to connect, and they like, what really seals the deal is when their friends or family members are on the other side of the screen, and they know that they can connect with them, and sometimes in real time, or at least if it's asynchronous, they're gonna get back to you, and there was something incredibly satisfying about that, and that happened on Plato for sure. I always liken it to just look at Star Trek. When you interacted with the computer on the show, I'm talking about the original series. You would say computer, and you'd hear the woman's voice, Marjorie Majel Barrett,
yes.
Saying working, and then you'd hear a teletype, which is goofy, but typical Hollywood, and they'd spit out some numbers and results and everything, and it was very crude, and that was considered futuristic. And even in the movie 2001, when you interacted with HAL 9000, it was just the same kind of thing. And what's crazy, in my opinion, is we're going right back there now with Alexa and OK Google and all that. Ooh, I shouldn't say that, I guess. But though I have said that on several radio programs, I've said, OK Google, go order 1 million copies of the Friendly Orange Glow.
Alexa, buy the Friendly Orange Glow. Yes.
Right. As many copies as you can get on Prime, of course. But yeah, so it's going to be really interesting. How do you do social the same way if we lose the screen and we lose the keyboard? And I think we're headed that way. I think we're actually. That's a whole different discussion, but it's an interesting one. But yeah, I think we're headed that way.
So how early is the networking component of it? A lot of it early on is, like you said, is asynchronous, so you can log in, interact, someone else can come behind you, see what you've done, and leave messages. But when does it get to be Minnesota, Illinois?
Well, a couple things to clarify. I mean, when all the social stuff started in 1973, it was basically instantaneous, and you could go online and you could live chat with people. There were chat rooms starting in '73. There were message forums. So chat rooms are live, and I mean they are liver than AOL Instant Messaging from the '90s, or particularly texting today, or Apple Message or something like that, or Facebook Message, which are basically little text boxes. You type something in, then you send, and then the recipient gets the whole block of text. Or maybe it has pictures too, or something like that. That wasn't the way Plato did it. Everything was live, character by character. So if I typed A, B, C, D, E, you saw A, B, C, D, E on your side. If I then did a backspace and got rid of the E, you saw on your side the E suddenly go away. So it was literally live typing. And when you have 5 people in a what was called Talkomatic chat room channel, all doing that at the same time, it's pretty intense to watch. And but it also turns out to be a great progress indicator from a user interface design perspective, because you could, it wasn't like the way, say, iOS, Apple's message program works now, or you'll see that it'll at least tell you that they're typing. You don't know what they're typing, but they're typing. Well, on Plato, you always saw exactly what they were typing, And that actually intimidated some users because it's like, I don't want people to see me making typos all the time.
I think so.
And or one thing that was amazing is some people were disabled and they were using Plato and they typed really painstakingly slowly. And if you didn't know that, and the person out there in the ether somewhere in the cloud was chatting with you, but they were really, really slow, the sort of the default assumption was that they were not very bright because they were typing slow, and that was never the case. It was just it took some time to type. So and then when they finally would meet face to face, the non-disabled person would be just completely blown away, and so there was a fascinating sort of thing going on in that regard too.
Well, maybe the way to do this, because I have it as a list here in my notes. Let's just go through these lists of innovations. So we're already talking, and these are maybe not created necessarily by Plato, but Plato is amongst the first to put these together in a large scale, like you're talking about. So we've been talking about Talkomatic, which is the online.
That's the chat room stuff.
Term Talk.
Term Talk arrived because of Talkomatic. So Talkomatic was done by teenagers. So that they could talk to their friends. I mean, it was pure social app, absolutely pure. And the system staff discovered, like, gosh, this chat stuff could be really handy. Why don't we build a instant messaging style? In other words, one-on-one, the equivalent of a typewritten phone call between any two users on the system. And we'll build it in such a way that you could be doing anything in the system and then invoke a chat at the bottom of the screen no matter what program you were in at the time. You could be even in the middle of a game or something, which would be really dumb because all your opponents would totally kill you by the time you got out of the chat. But so that was Term Talk, and that arrived in December of '73 and completely, changed everything overnight. There's a really interesting period of 12 months between 73 and 74 when this whole suite of social apps appeared. So there was Talkomatic, there was Term Talk, there was Plato Notes, which arrived in August 73, and that was basically message forums. And a guy named Dave Woolley, all of 17 years old at the time, he wrote that. And he wrote it from scratch. He had nothing to go by. There were no other message boards that he had ever seen or heard of. So he just designed it the way he thought it was, a reasonable way to organize it. And that design has carried through in pretty much every message board today, except for a certain kind of style, which is extremely tree structure, kind of like Reddit or other things where, you can post a topic, people can reply, and then they can reply to the replies and nest. I call that the cocktail party design, which means it's complete noise. You can't keep, they can't make heads or tails of anything. On Plato, things were much more linear in a true kind of message board fashion. So it was easier to sort of see where things were going in terms of the conversation. Then email arrived in '74 on Plato. It was called Personal Notes, which was basically a personal version of a private version of Plato Notes, which was the public thing. And then there was News Report, which was an online newspaper. And it was even crowdsourced. Now, they didn't use that word at the time, but if you look at it now, it's like, yeah, that was crowdsourced. Basically,
meaning that anyone could contribute an article.
Anyone could contribute articles, and if you got good at it and you kept doing it regularly, then you might get, reporter status. And if you did that enough, maybe they would bump you up to editor status. And so, it's an absolutely remarkable phenomenon. They were even wanting to do online ads. And the university completely shot that down, saying, we are a nonprofit institution, blah, blah, blah. But they were thinking that way. They would have done it if they could have. They tried to get press passes so they could cover events in town. And the police were like, you need to go to a computer to get on your newspaper? And, and they responded saying, like, well, you need to go to the newsstand to buy your newspaper? And they were at a total standstill. They never got anywhere. But it's kind of funny. All the thinking was there, and they would have done it, even a more full-fledged version of what we have today, if they could have. And it would have been really something. The whole notion of money driving everything was not there yet. In all these social apps, it was there for fun and for glory, basically, because you get real famous if you were the author of Talkomatic or some popular game. And there were lots and lots of famous kids going around who were really popular at parties. When they discovered you wrote so and so, that kind of thing. We're not worthy.
Well, let's talk about the games.
Okay.
And there's a whole list of them. But the point that I want to make is that these are, even through the mid to late 90s, the idea of true multiplayer games, as opposed to playing against the computer, was still a rare thing. But in the 70s, they're already doing...
Yeah, multiplayer was the norm on PLATO, except for things that were like solitaire type games, like literally solitaire or other card games and that kind of thing. And the way things started on PLATO 4, is also remarkable because the same pattern would emerge in the 90s with the net. And the term was a little different, but on PLATO, what emerged first was something called big board games. And the idea was you'd go into a game and you'd see this opening screen would be a list of available players, and they're looking for somebody to play with. And so you go down the list, you'd find somebody, and you would, tap C or whatever the command was to challenge them, and then the other person would get notified immediately, like, hey, so and so wants to play against you, and then you could accept or deny and that kind of thing. And if you both accepted, boom, you're in the game and duking it out, whether it was spaceships or airplanes or tanks on the moon shooting at each other and whatever behind mountains and craters and all that stuff. So big board games were a huge hit. And a number of things happened because of the big board games, one of which was they started adding messaging to that wait list page. And that's kind of where a lot of the chat stuff came from, because people were starting to discover, well, heck, if I can just yak with somebody online, that's just as much fun as going into the game. So that was, the intra-game messaging turned into a lot of chat stuff. And then in the 90s, you saw a whole bunch of companies come out that, they were venture capital backed and everything. Now, they had much bigger scale because we were already into like the 100 million level of internet users in the world, maybe in the, and growing into 1 billion very quickly. And that was, so you're talking about much bigger big boards, lists of available players and everything, but still that came, and they were very successful. And I think Steam and all that whole phenomenon today has a lot of that in it as well. And now that's a multi-billion-dollar company. It's just the only thing that's really changed, two things: the graphics and multimedia capability because of processing power, and the scale of the user community. PLATO was a tiny microcosm, but all the ingredients were there. So then people got kind of bored with the big board games and wanted to do more adventurous stuff, and literally adventurous stuff in the sense that Dungeons and Dragons, the board game, came out in like '74, I think it was. And there were D&D players at the U of I and in the high schools around there, and they started porting that game to the computer, just like people were doing elsewhere, but not with the ambitions that they were doing on PLATO. They started out with graphics, and they were, it was obviously more fun as a multiplayer kind of thing. So within the span of 18, 24 months, you started seeing dozens of dungeon games, and you started seeing this phenomenon that would happen again in the web, and then particularly in the smartphone app ecosystem, starting around 2008, with the iPhone and then Android. And that is everybody trying to outdo whoever made an app that was released the week before or whatever, with more features and a cooler and faster and better and more fun and all that stuff. So all that stuff was kind of going on to, build stuff as a reaction to what you had seen someone else build that caused a great reception among the users, and got that creator or group of creators fame and glory within the community. It's like, because that was the currency there. So if you could do something better and add some features and steal a little bit from all the other games and add some new stuff, and that was basically the pattern all through the 70s. There was this one group of 13-year-olds at one high school. They may have actually been in multiple high schools. A bunch of friends spent like 4 years working on a game, which was kind of like the equivalent of a motion picture studio spending years preparing Star Wars for release. And they came out with a game called Avatar, which was the Mount Everest of dungeon games.
It's been compared to like EverQuest.
It was absolutely had the same intensity and addictiveness. I mean, crazy addictiveness. People would stay out for multiple consecutive all-nighters, completely wrecking their personal relationships, their family relationships, their grades, their sleep, everything, just to go further into the dungeon and get more spells and weapons and gold and become a really powerful wizard or whatever it was. And of course the messaging within the game was really, really intense, and going on constantly, just flying the messages between players and everything. And so there was a lot of chat that had nothing to do with the game, in addition to people talking about game strategy and all that kind of stuff. And you could go down in groups and fight against. So the whole notion of traveling in groups was totally there in all of these games. Moria was another classic group travel game down into the dungeons, and the game designers had created it so that there was no way to survive on your own. You had to go in a group, which forced a social dimension to the game right from the very beginning. And so a lot of design sensibility that would emerge in the video games that we would see in the 90s and up to today on the web and on various game platforms. Those things were starting on PLATO, and a lot of times the designers moved off and worked in those games. So it wasn't like there's a disconnect. I mean, there is a general flow of the DNA out of PLATO into the gaming world.
Thinking of the social aspect, were there handles was your personality able to travel with you to various places on PLATO? Your identity maybe more than
there were a couple things. To get online you had to have an account, which was called a sign-on. And it's kind of funny because it was even today there's debates among real dweebs about whether the word login is a noun or is it a verb, right? Log in. And it basically is one of these weird things that has become a noun. Yeah. It's like, well, what's your login, your password? Right? But you're basically describing a verb. Well, on PLATO, which is this weird parallel universe where everything is almost the same, but just slightly different and different jargon, things were called sign-ons. And you signed on to the system and you had a password. And so, and then to make it a little bit more complicated, your sign-on consisted of two parts. Your name, which might be first, last, or some combination of, whatever, and a group, which was, the equivalent of today would be your name is everything to the left of the @ symbol in your email address, and the group would be everything to the right of the @ symbol in the email address. So it would be basically your domain. And that's how PLATO's sign-ons were set up. And that got you onto the system. But then when you went into some games, you could create your own name again. And the goal in so many of these games was to get onto the Hall of Fame, which was a game in its own right. This was a classic game design, fundamental design feature that you have to. It's not enough to just make a fun game. You also have to design something for the real masters of the game, so that there's another whole dimension to the game, which is, now you're trying to, if you get on the Hall of Fame, you've got to stay on the Hall of Fame, because once everyone else sees you made it, they're going to make it their mission in life to get you off the Hall of Fame. And so that was a whole sort of side dimension to all the games that were going on. So yeah, this is kind of what the dynamics were like in that community.
And if anybody remembers arcades in the 80s, that
Right.
sort of behavior continued.
Right. And
Yeah.
there's been tons of movies where they talk about the three initials.
Yep.
In fact, there was just what was the episode of one of the Netflix shows?
Stranger
Things, right? Where in the second series, where there's a whole episode about the name and the Hall of Fame or whatever. Yeah. So.
So you point out in the book that until about maybe 82, 83, Plato has a larger probable user base than what
ARPANET.
the ARPANET would have.
Right.
And then ARPANET sort of surpasses it about that point?
Well, yeah. I mean, basically, you have to understand that ARPANET was growing and growing and growing. It was a very different kind of thing. There wasn't some service that you signed on to or logged into that said, "Welcome to ARPANET."
Right.
It wasn't an online service. It was the network. It was the underlying infrastructure between all these different computers and everything that enabled you to connect from one to the other. And it's kind of funny, but for many years they kept printed books of all the names and the email addresses of all the ARPANET users. And so there is you can go back and look at these things. They still exist. And in fact, there was something on the net just a few months ago about that. Someone had dug one up and was showing it around. Well, that book got a little thicker starting in the 80s as the number of users started growing. But it also suggests, basically, again, the various labs in companies and in government and in universities that were all connected on the ARPANET were doing much more serious stuff typically than the kind of crazy gamer hacker scene that was going on Plato, which was pretty wild and out of control. You also understand that even that community of serious developers and all the gamers and the hacker types and the kids was but a fraction of the bigger Plato community, which was all the real reason Plato existed, which was education.
Right.
So, I've always estimated that, maybe 90% of the user community on Plato were just legit students sitting down because they were told to once a week and take this hour lesson. Maybe it's a chemistry lab simulation of pouring some solution into a beaker and then watching it explode on screen, rather than having explosions in the physical chemistry lab, which would be much more expensive and dangerous. So that was the kind of stuff they did all the time. And that community of users, some of them would discover that there was this cool social side to Plato, and if they made the leap to that cool social side, that might just wreck their academics forever. And there are numerous accounts of that in the book. It was a chronic problem and kind of an embarrassment and a great irony that this very system designed for students to be educated turned out to be the one thing that wrecked their educations. One guy told me that Plato was basically the best pinball machine ever created, at that in that era. So,
well, I don't know that I want to get into that. There's a whole nother story about CDC, the corporation coming in trying to commercialize it. Please buy the book. There's other entire layers to this story. How we're talking about the ARPANET and then the internet overtaking it. What at its height, what was the ultimate size or scale of that Plato achieved?
Well, Control Data did an awful lot to get Plato out to the world, and they did two things. They offered complete standalone systems, turnkey solutions, where you could, if you were a big, huge university or the NSA or some huge government agency, a lot of military bases decided to just buy their own Plato systems. So universities like University of Delaware, the University of Nebraska, University of Quebec, University of Alberta, a whole bunch of universities in the UK, in Europe, UK, Sweden, bunch of universities in South Africa. So Australia, all kinds of places around the world bought their own Plato systems. And then CDC also found that some people didn't want to spend all the $10 million on a on a PLATO system, but they wanted PLATO. So they'd get a whole bunch of terminals, sometimes like dozens, if not hundreds, and they'd be connected over phone lines or whatever back to a system that control data was running, essentially as a time sharing service. So lots and lots of. So if you added it all up, you're talking about many thousands of users, probably in the hundreds of thousands, in any moment, any day, and probably I don't know, something like 50 to 100 physical systems, maybe even more than that. The thing is, a lot of the three-letter agency uses of PLATO are still basically classified. I couldn't get anything on them. So we don't know. All we know is that their use was very clear. It was definitely happening. The scale of which we're not clear on, but most likely thousands of soldiers were being sent through it and learning Russian and learning cryptography and all kinds of crazy stuff that way through PLATO as well. So yeah, I mean, it was and then the National Association of Securities Dealers required PLATO for certification to become a stockbroker. So NASDAQ stockbrokers for like 10, 15 years used PLATO, and that was one of the most profitable things CDC ever did. And that was gigantic nationwide use of PLATO. And then the airlines did the same thing with the pilots were learning how to fly 767s using PLATO, all during the 80s and into the 90s. So there's lots and lots and lots of use cases, and it does add up to uncounted thousands. I don't think you can say millions, but certainly north of 100,000 total people, in all walks of life using the system. So it wasn't, and then many of these physical PLATO systems were interconnected on basically a crude internet-like network that was proprietary. They built it themselves. They designed and invented and patented their own super high-speed modems. Super high speed meaning about 9,600 baud in 1976, which was pretty blazing fast.
Yeah. I was still on 1,200 in 1989. So.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, and they were multiplex, so they could get They could crank a lot of users through that. And so yeah, that was how you, for example, connected to Illinois through Minnesota online in the 70s. And what they did, because they had these things linked, they all the email could be sent. So a sign-on now consisted of three things: your name, your group, and the system. So it would be kind of like, blah, 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 .domain.com rather than just domain.com. It was a further extending of the whole network. So that's how that, PLATO was kind of like a mini internet of its own. And it got pretty darn big.
So a few closing questions. The book is largely making the point, which you say explicitly, like that you believe that PLATO is the birth of the interpersonal computer revolution, not the personal computer revolution.
Right.
And the reason are all the things we've just been talking about. But go into that a bit more. Why do you think it was the birth of this interpersonal computing?
Just look at the timing. All this stuff started in 72. We're talking about the PLATO 4 system, and then really exploded in that 12-month period of, like halfway into 73 and then halfway into 74. It was, and in that period, you basically suddenly had a complete suite of apps, as it were, that were sufficiently addictive, but also sufficiently productive, in terms of using for collaboration and in a work context. It wasn't all fun and games. I mean, you could use the notes in the chat, and they did all day long for serious work, and it gave you an incredible advantage over any other project that, especially if people are physically located in remote locations, different offices, as they were on PLATO. To be able to just instantly chat with somebody was, gigantic, and you didn't even have to track them down on the phone because everyone was always online. And if you just look at the timing of this in a sort of a typical computer history timeline, This is a time when the founders of Google were still in diapers, so they were not players yet in this whole thing. Apple and Microsoft had not yet even been incorporated. This is a time when the idea of a personal computer is essentially something like the Altair, which is a box with some blinking lights.
A kit. Yes.
A kit.
Yeah.
We're serious, diehard tinkerers. Loved this stuff, and yes, it was incredibly exciting. You could own your own personal computer, and within just months, you started seeing the basic programming language, which, just like HTML and just like Tutor, was a giant leap forward in terms of productivity, and you could do cool stuff and all that. And so, but if you look at the personal computer revolution, basically, it's a surfboard riding the Moore's Law wave, right? Where every year the chips are doubling in power and halving and cutting it by half the cost every single year. So things are getting faster, cheaper, smaller, better, and but they're all just lonely islands. They're not really interconnected. And you have your own personal computer and you can hug it and, show it off to your friends at home and that kind of thing. But when you're looking at the screen, you're not looking at a community behind that screen that could be in the thousands, who are there to chat with you and, communicate with you and connect with you and all that. That wasn't even the thinking behind personal computing. It has become that now. And really, when we talk about personal computing now, we're really talking about deep, deep levels of interpersonal computing. And that is now the real definition of personal computing. But I would argue with this book, I think things can now be seen in a different light because we never had this evidence documented before in an accessible way. And that was one of the great tragedies of the whole history of computing in the last 30, 40 years, is that every single book that came out, even all the best-selling ones, would not even have one mention of Plato in the index of that book.
Well, that was actually going to be my next question. To the extent that you have a theory on this, why has Plato slipped through the historical cracks, as it were?
Well, a number of reasons. One, the personal computer revolution was so overwhelming and came on so fast and added a new dimension that hadn't existed with Plato, which was money. You could grow rich doing personal computing, and we have billionaires galore to prove it, right? And then many, many orders of magnitude more millionaires to prove it too. And stories of all these success stories. It was basically a gold rush. And in America, gold rushes rule in terms of history. If you look at the whole, move west of civilization, wiping out anything in its way to get to the gold, And I think the rise of personal computing and then the web and the internet and everything is a gigantic gold rush that we're still going through. Plato didn't have that. So it basically just got completely trampled by this new thing that was shiny and that got media attention. Plato didn't get media attention. You could go and jump up and down and show the orange screen to the New York Times and the Washington Post all day long, or try to get someone from 60 Minutes or some television show to do a segment on Plato. And I've often likened it to trying, put a dog in front of a television and tell them to watch, and they'll just have this blank stare in their face for a few seconds, and then they'll turn away because they don't see it. And most people just couldn't get it. They had no reason to understand why it was cool or whatever. It took a long time to educate the mainstream public that this stuff was really powerful. It would take 25 more years. Even in the 90s, it was still sort of nerdy. Up to like 95 or whatever, there was still a relatively small population. Remember, we called it the information superhighway. I used to call it the information footpath. But I mean, it was modest.
Well, I'm going to make a direct analog that I know you're aware of, but since this is on this show, I've gone into great detail about Netscape being sort of the opening bell of the modern internet era.
Right.
The exact analog is Mosaic is a project at the University of Illinois that it's not until they leave the university and go out west and form Netscape and then have this multi-billion-dollar IPO. That's the riches that you're talking about. That's the difference. Had they never left Illinois, had it maintained just the Mosaic project, would it have had the same impact that Netscape had?
It actually might have, because there was another browser company in Illinois, Spyglass. And some of the Spyglass people were Plato people. One of them was Brand Fortner, who had written Airfight, one of the best air combat games ever done. Totally multiplayer, insanely addictive. That was done in 74. So, and then he went on to great fame as working at NCSA in scientific visualization, and he was one of the, I think, founders, if not certainly one of the early people in Spyglass. And Spyglass had a spectacular IPO. Of course, Spyglass, who are they, right?
Well, I've had a couple of them on the show. Yeah.
Cool. There you go. That's great.
So
that's comprehensive.
Again, the book is The Friendly Orange Glow. By Brian Deere. It is available everywhere books are sold. I want to point out that this is one of the most intensely researched technology history books I've ever seen. This is 30 years in the making.
Yep.
You have, I think, maybe 1,000 personal interviews and things like that.
It was about 13,000, 14,000 emails since 1996. And 7 million words of typed interview transcripts. I don't know if you transcribe this, but if you do, my sympathies.
No, I throw them all up into the world, and that way I don't have to transcribe.
Right.
Someone can come behind me and do that, please.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to do this whole thing as a movie documentary, to tell you the truth, way early on. But the cost was just crazy, because when I started this project, it would have had to have been film.
Yeah.
And or cheap videotape, and it would have looked really crummy. I mean, if I could have done it in HD, I probably would have done it. If the equipment that exists today, heck, I would have done the whole thing on iPhones, for crying out loud.
Exactly.
It'd be gorgeous.
Yeah.
So I wanted to do a documentary. It would have saved me a heck of a lot of time. I would have spent years in editing and post-production, quote unquote, but it would have come out as a movie. A 22-hour movie, right?
Well, that's what things like Netflix are there for now,
Right.
So 22 one-hour episodes.
There you go. It's exactly total, binge-worthy.
Exactly. Well, the point of the book, I think, clearly for Brian, is to correct this historical oversight of the importance of Plato, and I do not believe that there will ever be a more comprehensive look at this particular story. I highly recommend it. The Friendly Orange Glow. Brian Deere, thank you for coming on the show and telling us about Plato and the book.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
If this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, please subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. There's plenty more great internet history where that came from. And if you're a longtime listener, then you know what to do to help us out. Rate and review us on iTunes. Because iTunes gives credit to reviews and ratings, and the more great reviews we get, the more people will discover us. As always, there's more info on our website, www.internethistorypodcast.com. The show's Twitter handle is @NetHistoryPod, and my personal Twitter is @BrianMCC. Thanks for listening.